What's up, everybody, and welcome back into another episode of the Lawyer You Know podcast. A little bit more relaxed and chill episode as we're still on vacation. And to start out the new year, I am bringing you one of your favorite guests that's never been on the podcast before, been on the YouTube channel a lot, and we'll introduce him when we actually start for anybody that's new to the channel and doesn't know his background. But my dad is coming on to talk about the Luigi Mangione case. And we're going to do a deeper dive than we've ever done before on this podcast. So you don't have to go back and listen to hours and hours of videos if you don't want to, unless you want a deeper dive on those specific topics. But today we're going to give you a timeline overview of what happened in the death of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare. We're going to talk about all of the charges and how they're state charges and federal charges and why and how that's possible. We're going to talk about the public discussion around this case, what people are saying, what they're thinking, how that could affect a jury trial or how this case is litigated throughout. And of course, our favorite thing, we're going to answer so many of your questions that we've gotten on other videos that we haven't been able to answer or from social media flooding in over the last days and weeks since this happened. So let's get to it now. So for anybody that's new to the channel here, my dad and I are actually on vacation together in separate rooms though, because we got people sleeping and everybody else is kind of quieted down in the house. But now's the perfect time for us to get to talk about some of our interests in this case. And he's been a lawyer for 50 years. About 40 of it has been private practice, which is criminal defense, state and federal level, handling cases on both in both types of jurisdictions. But as a prosecutor, for the first 10-ish years of his career, he was an assistant state attorney on the state side, then moved up to kind of the big leagues in federal court as an assistant U.S. attorney. And he was the chief assistant U.S. attorney of the criminal division, who was basically the boss of all the prosecutors in the Middle District of Florida, making all the charging decisions, dealing with the high profile cases that would come in to that office for his tenure there, which is why he's the perfect person to ask about cases like this, where we have a high profile case. We had a manhunt. We've got so many different things going on. We have media reporting on it. We've got public interest. We've got high profile attorneys handling it. We've got state charges. We've got federal charges. We've got extradition hearings that have happened in this case. And Dad, I think the best place to start is kind of back at the beginning, the first kind of information we have reported about Luigi Mangione. And it's important to remember that a lot of these are reported facts or alleged facts. They haven't been proven in a court of law. But let's talk about a timeline to kind of give people an overview if they're new to the case or if they've been following it religiously, a good place to start so they can follow throughout our discussion tonight.
Well, sure. Well, I'll start with November 18th. He's reported missing by his mother to the San Francisco Police Department. November 24th, he is seen on CCTV getting off a bus in New York, a bus that comes from Atlanta. He checks into a hostel using a fake New Jersey driver's license. He stays on and off in that hostel until December 4th, which is the fateful day. And then the allegations are that on December 4th, he leaves the hostel. He takes an e-bike. He stops at Starbucks. He buys a water and a protein or a kind bar. He eats that. He then heads over to the Hilton Hotel. The allegations are that there he was masked and he was waiting for the CEO of the healthcare, United Healthcare. The CEO comes. He comes over to him. He shoots him once. The allegations are that he goes over, shoots him again. The gun jams. He has to unjam the gun, shoots again. He then leaves. He takes a bicycle. He leaves the area. He goes to a bus station. At that bus station, they thought he got on a bus, but they checked all the CCTV. Allegedly, he did not get on a bus. And he then goes to the subway. And then the subway is a theory because they don't have any evidence of that from what I understand. That the theory is he got on a subway from the bus station. He went to Penn Station. He got on a train, and that train took him to Philadelphia. And he's been bouncing around between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh until December 9th. On December 9th, at a McDonald's, Mr. Mangione lowers a face mask that he has when he's eating a French fry or some kind of fried potato. And when he does that, a person in the McDonald's looks at him and says he looks like the picture that's been going around everywhere. And he tells a McDonald's employee McDonald's employee then calls the Altoona Police Department, Altoona, Pennsylvania. They come to that location. They confront him. When they first confront him, he shows them the fake New Jersey driver's license that he showed to rent the room at the hostel. When they ask him if he's ever been to New York, he starts to shake. They ask if that's his real name. He then gives them the real name. He is arrested. He is charged with the various offenses there. He is then turned over he eventually waives extradition, turned over to the New York Police Department. He is transported by air to New York, then by helicopter, and then he is charged and arraigned both federally and state in New York as well as in Pennsylvania. And the case now moves on.
Yeah, and I mean that's about as brief of a timeline as you can get to where he's estranged
Right.
from his family. They even report him missing. Then he ends up in New York, and they've got, like you said, they've gone through hours and hours and hours of CCTV video. The shooting happens, and then he's picked up at a place of all places, McDonald's, and that's after a national manhunt. The picture of him has gone over social media, out to media outlets all over the world. Basically, everybody is seeing this guy's face, so much so that he's recognized. And when he's arrested, what does he have with him? But of course, a backpack with the firearm, the suppressor that was also part of this case, that he used a suppressor on the street. The shooter did, I should say. And Mangione was found with one on his person. And of course, writings and a manifesto that I'm sure we'll get into when we get into more of the details of the case, saying that he basically had a motive to do this and he, in fact, acted alone. So he was arrested in Pennsylvania on some lesser charges, carrying a firearm, um, some forged documents because he had the fake ID and things like that.
Yeah.
But the major charges came in New York. So when he first gets to New York, he's extradited to the New York State law enforcement, and he is first charged with a bunch of state crimes. So now let's discuss all of the charges that Luigi Mangione is looking at and the potential sentences or max sentences with these charges. Let's start with the state charges.
Well, the state charges there's two types of murder they've charged him with. New York is a little bit different than most states in that New York has a second degree murder that
So
most
let's
states would
just
consider.
let's just call them first degree and second degree. Everybody knows what we're talking about. They know what the crimes are, but let's just call them first degree, second degree, and any other lesser included we want to discuss.
Well, they have a second degree that most people would say is a first degree in most states. And they have a first degree. That first degree is usually reserved for law enforcement, where there is a law enforcement death. Uh, and but in this case, they're using it because it also talks about terrorism. So they're charging him also with a terrorism killing, which ups it to life without parole. They don't have the death penalty in New York. So
State.
we have New York State, correct. So they have that first degree, then they have the second degree they've charged him with, which would be life with a mandatory minimum sentence. And then they have various other firearm and false ID and those kind of offenses. Altogether, if you look at all three jurisdictions, the Pennsylvania, federal, and New York State, we have 20 counts or 20 separate charges. So again, New York has two first and second degrees, and then they charge him with the various other false identifications, firearms offenses, because we have a firearm used in a felony, plus we have a firearm here that is unregistered and is illegal firearm with a suppressant so that you can't hear the sound. So that makes it also an illegal weapon.
Yeah, and there's some of the details that make this case different and even more interesting. Are it was a quote unquote ghost gun where parts of it were printed with a 3D printer. At least that's what reports have been saying. Number one, number two, so many people were up in arms when they heard he might just be charged with second degree. Why would it not be first degree? It seemed intentional. It seemed premeditated. Well, in New York, an intentional premeditated killing like this can be second degree, but like you said, certain enhancements get it up to first degree. We didn't really think or know what enhancement were they going to use because it wasn't a police officer, it wasn't a federal employee. But then we see this terrorism thing, and we've discussed on other videos what that actually means. And you have to try to influence a unit of government or force some kind of policy change. And people didn't really know exactly how they're going to fit that square peg into a round hole, and that's still yet to be determined. We do know that there are some documents that he wrote, and we'll talk about some of the quotes in there. But we talked about the state charges. What is he charged with federally?
Well, federally, it starts out with they have to get federal jurisdiction. So federal jurisdiction comes from some kind of an interstate, we call it nexus, but an interstate involvement, multiple states. So how does this case involve multiple states? Well, he came from another state into New York, and he did that for the purpose of stalking somebody in order to commit a crime. So he stalked an individual across state lines to commit a crime. Well, that gives them the jurisdiction. That's the federal jurisdiction now. So now we have interstate commerce that's affected. Then they're able to charge him with an offense and with a homicide, and that offense is a type that results or could result in a death penalty because the federal government has the death penalty. We've heard a lot lately about commuted sentences in federal court because of the people that are sitting on, quote, the federal uh, death penalty in Terre
Death
Haute, I
row.
believe is where they are on death row, right? I think they're all in Terre Haute. So there is a federal death penalty, but there is not a New York death penalty. So because of that, now he faces the death penalty on his federal charges. Again, they've charged him with some other various firearms offenses and things like that for crossing state lines. But the main one is the one that could result in the death penalty.
Right, and let's talk about this for a second because this is probably the number one question we get on Twitter. A bunch of people came through with this question on YouTube, Instagram. People are asking, how is it possible that he can be charged both state and federally? You've explained the federal nexus. You've explained how we get to federal charges because you can't just charge any case. You can't just charge any killing federally. There's got to be some nexus. In this case, it was stalking across state lines, interstate criminal action. Okay, that's how you get it to be federal because if you're committing crimes in multiple states or going from one state to the other, sometimes it can get confusing what state has jurisdiction. That's why the federal government is allowed to do stuff like this. But we have a situation here where the state could have handled this perfectly fine. Each state has their own charges. Each state has the community that they're protecting and that they're fighting for justice for and that they represent. So, why did this case also go federal?
Well, the legal reason it can go federal dates back to when the country was formed, when states had certain rights and the federal government has certain rights. And the Constitution specifically says if it's not stated in the Constitution, this authority goes with the state. So the states are sovereigns in their own right, and the federal government is a sovereign in its own right. And therefore, it's not double jeopardy for two separate sovereigns, two separate, basically, countries to charge you with the same crime. The federal government can charge you with the same crime that the state charged you with, and it's not double jeopardy because they're separate sovereigns.
So there have been some discussions, and we're Florida lawyers, although we have handled some cases in New York as well, on some pro hoc individual levels. But there is some argument that if the federal case were to go first, the state case would be barred for double jeopardy. I've seen some arguments made about that. I've read some things that could be an argument. So how do they usually choose who goes first? And when I say who goes first, I mean who has the first crack at him? Because in most cases, the federal government, they're the more powerful one, they're the big brother. But how is it normally decided who goes first?
The norm is the first person to have them in custody is the first one to charge them. That's the norm. Doesn't have to be that way, but normally that is followed. In this case, New York State was the first one to have him in custody. Therefore, they are the primary prosecutors. So they will charge him first. When they're finished with him, then he'll go to the federal government. And I understand, again, we've seen from the hearings we've watched that there's an agreement. They all are in agreement, the federal authorities and the state authorities, that that's the way it's going to proceed.
Basically the state prosecutor said the feds allowed them to have the first crack at him. And I have to wonder myself that those arguments that, the state claim may be barred by double jeopardy if the feds went first, if that didn't come into all of the prosecutors, the back of their minds, that we can both get a crack at him if the state goes first, because New York maybe handles things a little bit differently. But to avoid double jeopardy, just legally speaking, as a federal prosecutor, when you were, that was something that would happen, right? Where there would be state charges and you would still decide to charge them federally, and there are no double jeopardy issues, even though it seems like you're putting somebody in jeopardy twice for the same crime. Thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode. And when it comes to winter, it's like survival of the fittest out there. And anyone is willing to do or buy whatever to stay warm throughout the winter. So many of you are in much more colder climates than I am here in Florida, but even I need some jackets to wear. And when I went on the Quince website, I was shocked at the colors and styles that they had that you can mix and match with so many different outfits. I loved it. One of my favorite brands to work with so far. And I picked the suede bomber jacket that is absolutely perfect for Florida winters and even probably a little bit colder than the climate that we have here. And what's great about Quince is you can treat yourself to the true quality at an affordable price. They use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the cost of the middlemen, Quince passes the savings directly on to you. Luxury and coziness without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/LYK for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/LYK to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/LYK.
Happens all the time. It happens all the time. How many times have we seen police officers, for instance, charged in cases, and then they are also charged by the Department of Justice in civil rights
Mm-hmm.
violations? So they are charged in state trials, and then they have a federal trial as well. Now, we've seen that over and over again. So we know it happens, and we know there's no double jeopardy issue there.
Yeah, and it in even some cases we've covered on our channel, Derek Chauvin's case, Ahmaud Arbery was the victim in a case where that happened, where there were state and federal charges, and there's going to be more that we follow in the future. This will not be the last one that there are state and federal charges at the same time. And another reason why potentially they wanted to go with federal charges is um, the death penalty, like you said, because New York State doesn't have it, but the feds have it. So more leverage for the prosecutors, more leverage in potential plea deals, and the prosecutors can potentially work together, and there's nothing really wrong with it. And again, the FBI has done a lot of work in this case, looking through surveillance, going through terabytes of documents. NYPD, the state cops have done a lot. The state cops in Pennsylvania have done a lot, and they're all going to work together and share information. We've also seen the defense demanding information from the feds and from state law enforcement.
Well, I have
Um,
seen, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
so go ahead.
I have seen reports, and I've also seen a press release and a press conference where Merrick Garland has spoken about this particular case. And it's been reported that all the way from the top, it came down to the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, the Southern District of New York. They were told that they were also going to be prosecuting this case. So it was not something just local with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, but at the Department of Justice, the Attorney General himself came out saying that they wanted to prosecute this case because they thought it was just so heinous and outrageous they wanted to go after it.
Yeah, and another reason they probably want to, and another reason this is probably coming from the top, um, not to mention just how powerful and big the victim is and the company the victim works for, but there's been a ton of public discussion around this case. And that's what most people are talking about and want to talk about. So it is no secret that people do not like the insurance industry. But I didn't know personally it was this bad nationwide. I personally I have done a lot of criminal defense, especially earlier in my career. I prosecuted cases earlier in my career, but for the vast majority of my career, 95+% of my work has been plaintiff's personal injury work, and 95% of that plus is suing insurance companies and fighting insurance companies. We've had multiple bad faith cases and bad faith claims where insurance companies just do things that are so shady and underhanded. They try to screw over our clients. They do deny and depose and defend our clients. They try to wait them out. They try to use anything they can to pay as little as they can. They put profits over people. So I get it. I get that sentiment. I'm not a big fan of insurance companies. There are good insurance companies, I guess, probably. I'm not sure I know of any. There are good insurance adjusters. There are good people that work in the insurance industry. Not every person that works in the insurance industry is bad at all. There are some great people that work in it. But generally speaking, a lot of big companies put profits over people. And in this situation, a lot of people have come together and discussed how unfair the healthcare system is, how they feel like the healthcare system has taken the lives of their loved ones by denying life-saving healthcare or denying paying for it or not approving it. Whether the doctors are at fault, the insurance companies, the CEO of insurance companies. And we've seen in the writings how Luigi Mangione has specifically targeted insurance companies by putting profits over people and saying that it keeps getting more and more expensive. They're becoming a bigger and bigger company and a bigger and bigger moneymaker in the industry, like Google and Facebook, and then health insurance. And yet our health care is getting worse and worse. It's not fair. It's a situation where people are getting screwed, lives are being taken, and somebody has to do something about it. These people had it coming, and those types of writings are reportedly in the documents found on Luigi Mangione's person when he was arrested. So, why don't you talk a little bit about what you're reading and hearing reported about the public discussion around this case?
Well, uh, United is, from what I understand, the largest uh, insurer of its type. Their profits were $16 billion last year, at least that's what I've read. Uh, but you look at the surveys, and they've been, and these are recent surveys, and they were specifically geared toward this case. And the surveys are the majority of people, they don't say it's okay to take a life, but a majority of people will say that the insurance companies contributed to the reason that this happened, that they were part of the reason, that they are partially to blame. There's a lot of that out there. And the surveys really are showing that. They had a 41% of young adults, and I'm not sure how they define young adults. 41% of them said that it was an acceptable outcome for this taking of a life. When I was a prosecutor, I never had a situation where when I was picking a jury, I had to ask them things like, do you think it's acceptable for someone else to take a life? But here, when they do the jury selection, that's going to be a huge, huge question because, like I say, the public sentiment, again, was really surprising at how unpopular. I'm wondering if the health insurance companies aren't shocked themselves as to exactly how unpopular they are and how many people say that they are partially to blame for this death.
Yeah, I myself was surprised as somebody who, again, like I said, fights and sues insurance companies all the time. It is so shocking because people are coming out in droves supporting him. Hashtag free Luigi. Fan clubs. He's a good looking guy. So, this wouldn't be the first time Dahmer and Ted Bundy and a lot of these guys, I'm not that, any of them are good looking or whatever. It's beauty in the eye of the beholder. But I think Ted Bundy was known as good looking, right? Dahmer was not, but whatever. They have these fan clubs, they have people writing in, but this is to a whole new level. People coming to support him in court. People are writing online about him and fighting hard. Keyboard warriors taking his back, backing him by storm. Tons of people supporting him. And it would be one thing to support the cause of there's a problem with health insurance, there's a problem with medical billing in our country. And I agree with that cause. But to support somebody taking the life of somebody who's married with kids for their job, right? Is next level and is something that I wasn't so sure we'd have to worry about. But now here we are. And if you're prosecuting this case, jury nullification has to be a question you ask. We have already also seen law enforcement and prosecutors in some of their press conferences say it's despicable the people that are supporting him. And I think that's why everybody's piling on and everybody in the government's kind of getting behind this groundswell of we have to basically make an example out of him. And they've done some things to try and make an example out of him. But as far as jury nullification goes, the best way you can deal with that is when picking a jury in voir dire. And I can guarantee you a ton of time is going to be spent by lawyers on both sides trying to figure out exactly what you said. How do people feel about insurance companies? And another one of the most asked questions we've gotten on any of our video comments or on social media is, do you think jury nullification is going to happen here? And what types of cases, or are there any famous cases in the past where jury nullification has actually happened? So while you think about that for a second, let me just explain what jury nullification is. For anybody that doesn't know, jury nullification is when the jury disregards the law. We've seen in every case we've followed together on YouTube. Will you follow the law? Will you be a fair and impartial jury? If the judge tells you it's what the law is, will you do it regardless of what your personal beliefs are, what you think should happen? Well, jury nullification is when they say, you know what? I am not going to follow the law. So even though this person is legally guilty for some other reason, or because I just think it's not fair, it's not just, we are still going to say not guilty. So it's like you have a video, and I'll tell you the type of case while you get into maybe some famous cases, but it's, somebody finds out their child was abused by somebody. They show up to that person's house and they beat them to a bloody pulp. Well, technically, they have committed a crime. right? They have committed assault, they have committed battery. Even though this person has done something bad in the past, it's not self defense because they weren't stopping them from continuing to commit a crime. So they go to trial, they show a video of them beating a bloody pulp, but it comes out that this was in response to what they did to their child. And the jury's like, you know what? I would do the same thing, not guilty, even though there's a video of them committing a crime. Now, of course, there's all sorts of what ifs, and no analogy is perfect, but that's generally what jury nullification looks like, an example of a type of case it would happen in. But what are some cases that you know of or can remember maybe from history where jury nullification has been a thing?
Well, first, I mean, that example you gave is good jury nullification, where they're doing something for a good reason, allegedly. There were cases, again, jury nullification is hard to prove. That's the reason the jury did it, because jurors never have to tell you why they found somebody not guilty. So you have to make some assumptions in some cases where the evidence was all there, yet the jury still found them not guilty. For instance, again, some recent cases, a lot of the draft dodger cases back in the Vietnam War, where they prosecuted draft dodgers, is an easy case. Did you go to the draft? No. Did you show up? No. Why not? I didn't want to go to Vietnam. Not guilty. We found not guilty cases in those. There are some bad examples of jury nullification. Let me tell you one bad example. In the Old South, a white man is accused of beating up a black man. His jury is a bunch of old white men, and they find not guilty, even though all the evidence is there. That's jury nullification. That's a bad example of jury nullification, but that's what it is when jurors refuse to follow the law.
And that's exactly like the perfect example of what fair and unbiased means, right? When we ask jurors that, so much of it comes from our history of the court system sometimes being in place where somebody's bias and somebody's unfair way they look at things and forcing certain things made the decision that affected people's lives based on their partiality, based on their bias. And that's what we try to get rid of now.
Right, and that's why it's technically unethical to argue jury nullification now before a jury. It really, a lawyer is not supposed to say, "Look, yeah, my client's guilty. Yeah, my client did it, but you find him not guilty anyway."
Yeah,
You're
because
not
it's the good
supposed to
old
make
boys
those
club.
arguments.
Yeah, it's
Right.
like, just find him not guilty. We're all white here. Do we really care about him? That would be a horrible, unethical jury nullification argument.
And that's why it's important to follow the law. And that's why you can't, it goes both ways. If you allow a jury not to follow the law in cases that maybe there's some good reason not to follow the law, but it's not that juror's responsibility to not follow the law, they have to follow the law, because there's bad situations and you don't want jurors to let people off in bad situations either. So jury nullification is going to be a big problem in this case, because here's again what I would anticipate. I would anticipate that whatever judge eventually tries this case, they're going to have a huge jury panel. They're going to bring in hundreds of individuals as potential jurors to question. Then they're going to do written jury questionnaires to all the jurors in order to find out what their bias and prejudices are. It's very hard to get behind people because a lot of times they mask those bias and prejudices and they don't really tell you the truth when you ask them questions. So you've got to ask a lot of questions in order to really get behind how that person really thinks. And I do think they're going to have to be conscious of that.
Yeah, I don't. I think that at the end of the day, they'll be able to vet the jurors enough to where I don't think this is going to be a major issue, especially when they really put forth the facts of the case. But I do think, jurors don't make law. And if they're not going to follow the law, now they're creating a new law. They're creating an exception to a legal argument or a law or a statute that does not exist. That's for the lawmakers, that's for the legislators, that's for the politicians. Now, I think confidence is going down in all them too, right? Which is why the world is kind of swelling into this like, we need to make sure stuff is fair. We need to do things that's right. We need to take back the power. And that's where it can get dangerous when the law is not followed. When, like, yeah, one time you might be behind it, but the other you might not. And that's where it can really get dangerous. And that's a big question people have in this case is, will jury nullification be a thing? And I mean, the only answer we can really have for it at this point is we've got to wait and see, although I don't think it's going to be an issue that actually happens at trial if we get to a trial.
Well, and that could be, again, I'm speculating, but that could be part of the problem with charging this as a terrorism,
Hmm.
because will a juror really look at this as terrorism? Are they going to have problems with a jury and convincing a jury that this was terrorism as we understand terrorism? I think that's a problem with charging it that way. And it's going to go both ways because it's going to allow um, the prosecutor to bring in a lot of evidence and a lot of ideas in here because it's terrorism. But it's going to allow the defense to bring in a lot of things as to the reasons for this and why it's not terrorism.
Yeah, and I was gonna just do all the questions at the end, but I think it might be more fun to mix them in kind of as we go. Um, and somebody asked, TC Keith asked, "Do you feel the infamous perp walk and mayor comments will have an effect on Luigi Mangione's case pre or post trial? Curious your take on this." So when we talk about overcharging potentially with the um, uh, enhancement of terrorism to the first degree charge or to get it to the first degree charge. And we talk about the perp walk, which we'll put a picture of it on the screen. It literally looked like a Gotham City Batman villain walk with all law enforcement, with all these long guns, and the mayor saying he wanted to look him in the eye and tell him, "You can't come do these things in New York," basically. The defense has argued that's going to poison the jury pool. It's unfair. They're violating his right to a fair trial. Do you think this is going to be a big part of the case?
No, I don't think the perp walk is going to be any part of the case. Yes, it was pretty outrageous. Yes, it was a real show. How many times does the mayor of New York City walk around behind prisoners that they're being? I mean, it was obviously just this huge public relations show. But as far as the trial goes, it's going to have no impact on the trial. It won't come into evidence. The jurors aren't going to see it. And people, when you do studies, and I've done high profile cases where I've been shocked at how few people knew about the high profile case. I knew about it because, I'm a lawyer, I read the paper every day. But how many people don't read the paper every day? How many people don't watch the news? And, a lot of people, I think probably the majority of people didn't see the perp walk. So I don't really think that it's going to be an issue. I mean, they're going to make it an issue. They're going to try to make it an issue, but I don't think it's going to be.
Yeah, and I think that they've already kind of, talked about it and put it on the record. So I don't know how much a judge is going to let them belabor the point, but the defense has already put on the record that they think that that's, part of an unfair trial, which I think is fine. I think they can argue that. And we'll kind of see if anything else comes from it. How do you expect, because of all this public interest in the case, a lot of it positive for the defense, how do you expect them to use that as they litigate this case? Do you think it'll become a part of discovery? Will it become a part of the trial? How is it going to affect the litigation of this case, do you think?
Just start that again. What specifically? What was that? The
Just like
very
all the
beginning
public
again?
interest in the case, all the public interest in the case, all the positive
Well,
support.
oh, okay. The only way that that's going to come in is if they try to do a change of venue, where they actually try the case someplace else because there's so much pretrial publicity that they can't get a fair juror. I don't think that's going to happen in this case. I don't think there's any better place for them to try this case than New York City, and I think New York City is the right venue. So this pretrial publicity, it's all great, it's all important, and you want to make sure that jurors aren't, tainted by it. And again, we talked about the voir dire before and selecting the right jury for jury nullification. You've also got to select the right juror for somebody who has not been influenced by all the pretrial publicity.
Yeah, and I do think that's important. And speaking of pretrial publicity, a lot of evidence has been reported that's been gathered against Luigi Mangione already. Even his own lawyer, Karen Friedman Agnifilo, um, she was a commentator. So we'll talk about her for a second. So Luigi Mangione hires a lawyer in New York, Karen Friedman and Figlio. Um, Agnifilo, sorry, she's one of those names that like my brain freezes every time I say it. Like I don't know how to say it. But so she was a top state prosecutor there for like 20 plus years, very experienced, knows what she's doing. Her husband, Mark Agnifilo, represents P. Diddy. So, and they're in a firm together. So, a lot of experience, state and federal, because P. Diddy charges are federal. So, they should be able to handle both of them. They were both at the arraignment. So, they're both probably working on all these cases, which is normal in a law firm for multiple lawyers in the law firm to work on this case. And so, she's the lawyer on the case. She mentioned she also commentated on CNN. I believe she has a podcast. and she worked on or consulted on Law and Order. But she said they seem to have so much evidence against him. The only thing she really sees as a defense is an insanity defense. So that's her comment, is an insanity defense. So before we get to possible insanity defenses and things like that, why don't you go through some of the evidence that's been alleged either in law enforcement or prosecutor press conferences or been reported on media stations? Because there is a lot. It's not just we think it's him based on one snapshot of his face. There is that, of course, the eyebrows, the face, pulling down the face when he was at Starbucks, flirting or whatever he was doing, matching it up with his face. But there's so much more that's been reported. Why don't you give us some of that?
Well, let's start with a lot of this is unnamed sources. And so, we have to wait till the trial to see if it really exists. But here's what has been reported. Number one, they have the water bottle that I spoke about from Starbucks. They have the wrapper from the Kind bar. And the allegation is, or the report is, that his fingerprints are on there. They have a phone that he allegedly dropped while running from the crime scene. Allegedly, his fingerprints are on that phone. The shell casings at the crime scene match the ghost gun that was found in the backpack. Uh, as we all know, every time a bullet goes through a barrel, it's like a fingerprint. It makes special kind of creases and scratches on the bullet and on the shell casing. They are unique to almost every gun. So if you have that ghost gun, especially the ghost gun, probably because it's unique in itself, but you have the ghost gun, and if you have a shell, you can actually find out, does that shell, will it match up to any shell that comes out of that ghost gun? Allegedly, the shells do match up from the ghost gun. Then you've got the notebook as well as the 3-page handwritten letter where he talks about planning. He talks about what he's going to do, when he's going to do it, and what he wants to do. Then you've got all the CCTV that we talked about where they have managed to track all the movements of where he was, when he was, and where he went. He has made no incriminating statements according to the allegations that I've seen. So there's been no statements from his mouth confessing to anything. But you've got, it's just mounting up. Again, if you believe the unnamed sources or the reporting, the evidence is just mounting up against him. It's hard to imagine that there could be even more evidence, but my guess is there's going to be.
Yeah, and again, we've already mentioned some stuff like the fake ID that matches the hostel, the pictures taken, the e-bike used, the Starbucks stuff. Trying to think if there's anything else that we haven't said yet. The firearm in the bag that he was holding there at the McDonald's. Just so much evidence mounting against him. So that's why, because it seems like they're going to be able to prove that he's the guy that did it. We'll see if that actually happens. But in affirmative defense, like insanity, explain what that is. In federal court, how do you prove insanity? How would it work in this case? Would he be not guilty, or would he be going down to a lesser included charge? Things like that. Thanks to OneSkin for sponsoring this episode. This is the health habit I didn't know I needed. My hands were always so dry. I wash them all the time. They crack. The skin on my face is dry, and OneSkin has stepped in to that slot and solved that problem for me. It makes it feel so much more moisturized. It literally feels like my skin is drinking when I put OneSkin's lotions on my body. I absolutely love it. And it's a pretty cool company. It was founded and led by an all-woman team of skin longevity scientists. OneSkin is redefining the aging process with their proprietary OS01 peptide, the first ingredient proven to help skin look, feel, and behave like its younger self. Get 15% off with code LYK at oneskin.co. That's 15% off oneskin.co, C-O, not .com, with code LYK. After you purchase, they're going to ask you, where did you hear about them? So please support our show and tell them that we sent you. Invest in the health and longevity of your skin with OneSkin. Your future self will thank you.
Well, insanity is obviously he didn't know right from wrong. That's the simplest way, and that's a very simple way. It's much more complicated than that, but that's a very simple way of saying what the insanity is, so that he didn't know or appreciate the quality of his actions. that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. These
Eh,
notebooks and these papers, they're going to go both ways. They're going to be used by the defense if they do an insanity defense to show his state of mind at the time that he did it. They're going to be used by the prosecution to show how coherent he was when he wrote these things and how carefully he planned this. So everything's going to go both ways. There's always two sides to all of this stuff. But it's an affirmative defense, which means the defendant has to prove it. He has to raise it, and his lawyers have to put it forth as an affirmative defense. They are required to give notice to the prosecutors if they are going to use this defense. I think that is what, when we heard the hearing of the arraignment, I think that's what the prosecutor was referring to when the prosecutor said, reminded them that they have certain responsibilities to give us notices. I think he was specifically referring to any insanity notice. And so that's, what we're waiting to see. I don't know. We all know that insanity defenses are notoriously unsuccessful. They are rarely, if ever. I think it's less than 1% of insanity. I mean, I don't have the statistics, so I can't say that that's the actual fact. But it's a really small percentage of insanity defenses that are ever successful.
Yeah, and in an affirmative defense, like an insanity defense, you also have to admit you're the one that committed those acts. So he was the one there. He was the one on the TV. He did fire the weapon. He did commit the act, but he's not guilty for a reason because he is insane and couldn't understand or didn't know what he was doing or appreciate the consequences of his actions, like you mentioned there. Um, I think another big question that people have in this case is um, surrounding exactly how and when things are going to happen in this case. We've done a deep dive on the manhunt. We've done a deep dive on the arrest. We've done a deep dive on the federal complaint and those charges. We've done a deep dive on the arraignment. So we'll continue to do deep dives and individual videos on the individual big moments that happen in the case. But what do you expect to see happen now? Are we going to be in a lull? Is it going to be fast and furious? What do you think is going to happen now in the case? He's got his lawyer, he's got his team, the prosecutors are ready. What happens now in a case like this?
Well, we'll start out with discovery, which means the turning over of the evidence. The prosecution has a duty to turn all the evidence over in state court. Keep in mind, this is a state case. Discovery responsibilities are different in federal cases than they are in state cases. In the state of New York, they turn over a bunch of information. Once they turn over that information, we'll see a slew of motions, attacking the evidence, trying to kick the evidence out, trying to get the judge to rule that it's inadmissible, or trying to limit the use of the evidence. Um, and so there'll be tons of motions. There'll probably be motions complaining about not getting evidence, or that the prosecution didn't give us what we're entitled to, and there's additional information. So we're going to see a lot of that. The volume of evidence in this case is going to be huge because you got to realize how much CCTV that they looked at and are in here. And the defense is going to be allowed to look at all of it because they may have a theory that it was somebody else. Well, if it was somebody else, then they're entitled to look at all the CCTV to see if there was someone else that was in the neighborhood, someone else that walked by, somebody else that drank water at Starbucks, somebody else that ate a kind bar. They're entitled to see all that. So we're going to see a lot of motions based on discovery and a lot of motions trying to throw evidence out.
And Maria MB18 asked on Twitter along these lines. Luigi was a topic at Christmas dinner. I bet that was fun. We had so many questions about him, his capture, the charges, etc., and putting our opinions aside about the health insurance industry. Will this case get to trial? How difficult will it be to seat a jury since everyone has strong opinions? We've already kind of answered the second question about how difficult it will be to get a jury, but do you think this case actually gets to trial, or do you think it's one that sets more up that he might take a plea deal?
I think the case goes to trial. If I just don't see, I don't see the since the federal government has jumped in, and the reason they jumped in is because they have the death penalty. I just don't see them giving up the death penalty. They have made this a cause célèbre, so I really think that they're going to try this case.
Yeah, and it's always hard to know. I mean, I don't know. We're not intimately involved. We don't represent the defendant, but it has a lot of the elements. And one of the biggest elements to cases that go to trial like this, even if it seems like there's a ton of evidence, is, well, here's your offer, Mr. Mangione. You can take the death penalty, or you can take the death penalty, or you can take life, or you can take life. And it's like, why not go to trial? Also, we have a guy who might want to tell a story, might want to make more of a spectacle of it. We don't know. Seems like that could be part of this case. We'll see. But you think it's tracking towards no plea and going to trial.
I
Susan
just
G.
I'm sorry.
That's
I was
okay. Go
going to
ahead.
just say one thing, and again, this is not a political statement, but keep in mind the current president doesn't favor the death penalty. President Trump is coming in next. He has said that he does favor the death penalty. So we're going to have a different atmosphere toward the death penalty when this case goes to trial, because it certainly won't go to trial before January when the new president is sworn in. So I think the atmosphere is going to be different.
It might not even go to trial during his term.
Right.
Um, Susan G asks, "Hey Peter, what are some of the most famous or significant cases for jury nullification? Luigi seems to be garnering the same level of popular support as Bonnie and Clyde did for robbing the banks during the Great Depression." Yeah, we already kind of answered that, but Susan G is what prompted me to ask that question earlier. Um, Ella said the timelines seem all over the place and contradict itself. Also, the CCTV pictures look nothing like him. Does he have a good chance of beating the charges? So, this is a good question by Ella because it's like this is in the eye of the beholder too, and this is why we have jury trials. If she thinks the timelines are all over each or all over the place and contradict each other, that's something the prosecution's going to have to get over and explain. If she thinks it doesn't look like him, that's an argument maybe the defense will make that it is not him. But there seems to be more than just a CCTV picture and just a timeline. So we're going to have to kind of wait and see how the evidence develops during the trial if we get there. Um, D asked, what determines if or when the feds can take over a case?
Well, it's a again, this is kind of an agreement between the parties, the two prosecutors. The feds have said, again, if you can believe what was said at the hearing, and this was on the record in a court, the state prosecutor said that we're going first, we will be trying him first. So the federal government is just going to sit back and wait until it's time and then try the case.
Now I can join asked, how was law enforcement able to give us so many details of the crime when in most cases law enforcement say they can't provide details because it's an active investigation and they don't want to damage the case?
Well, there's your unnamed sources again that we have
Well,
seen so
no,
many times.
it's
They
not
have a
just
lot.
unnamed
They've been
sources. But I'm saying a lot of this, I think what she's talking about too, is what we've seen from press conferences come from the
yes.
mouth of law enforcement officers or prosecutors. She's right. And what this comes down to, in my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with me, my opinion is this comes down to law enforcement and prosecutorial discretion. When they want to share details and when it's good for them, or they think they need them, or they feel public support for a defendant and they want to try to hammer them, they're going to share some details. Sometimes they overstep the bounds. We've seen it used against and thrown in prosecutors' face when they give too big a press conference. So to me, the whole I'm not going to share this or I am going to share that, that's within their discretion.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's face it. Who doesn't think this case was treated differently than 5,000 other shootings that have occurred in New York City? And if I've offended New York City, I'm sorry. But there's thousands, hundreds of shootings in New York City. Come on, this is not the everyday case in New York. They've treated it differently from the beginning.
Azam asked, I'm wondering how someone is chosen to be a potential juror in a case. Who sends out the letters calling them for voir dire? And for Luigi, since there are polls that show a group of a certain age support him, can they just exclude that group?
I don't know how they do it in New York. I don't know if they do it there's two methods they normally do it: driver's licenses and voter registrations. I don't know which one of those two methods New York uses, but it's at random, it's blind. So we don't know they don't know the ages or anything about the people that they send the summonses out to. So they'll come in again. They don't exclude ages. They don't exclude ethnic groups. That would be unconstitutional.
Yeah, and no, they can't just say because there's this one poll result that says young adults all think that, this is okay or 41% that they can just strike all young adults. That's not how it works. They have to individually voir dire these individual potential jurors and they can only strike the ones that they can show can't be fair and unbiased for this trial at the voir dire, not just generally speaking. I also don't think, do you know, I mean, I'm sure it's happened, but I just can't imagine how a case gets a venue changed out of New York City. Like there's going to be a bigger metropolitan area with more potential people, or a quicker news cycle, or people that would have heard of it less than what's going on in New York City. Like you said, something new every single day. Um, okay, so now there's been a couple questions on here, so I'm not really positive how to frame it. But hey, Peter, have you seen the conflict of interest for the judge in Luigi Mangione's case? I think it's a magistrate. But why don't you talk first about kind of the difference between a judge and a magistrate, what they do, what they're doing in these cases, and then talk a little bit about the alleged conflict of interest there.
Okay. In the federal system, in the criminal systems particularly, there are two levels of judges. There are magistrate judges and district judges. District judges are appointed for life. They're the called Article 3 judges, or the judges that they talk about in the Constitution. Magistrates have 10-year terms. They're appointed by the district judges. Magistrates basically help the district judges. Like, for instance, instead of the district judge arraigning and getting the not guilty plea from Mr. Mangione, the magistrate did it. So the magistrate takes care of a lot of this. They takes care of a lot of the discovery issues and a lot of the arguments that go on. The magistrate judge takes care of those. So the district judge doesn't have to spend the time doing that. However, orders that a magistrate judge issues, a district judge can review those orders and overrule the magistrate judge. So again, they're helper, kind of lower level helper judges. Do you want me to go in the conflict of interest?
Sure, yeah. I'm
Okay.
looking for the next question because there's a lot of repeats, so I'm going to find
Okay.
the next question. So go ahead.
The conflict of interest in this case, I know what they're talking about because I've researched this particular magistrate. Number one, she is married to an individual that is currently the executive director of the New York City Bar Association. Before he had that job, he was in house counsel for multiple large corporations, including pharmaceutical companies. So he has healthcare experience. He was an attorney for healthcare companies. I think the last time that he did that was over 10 years ago. I don't think that raises a conflict just in itself, just because he was an attorney. He doesn't currently work for them. However, he does get a pension from them. So if you want to raise that, you can raise that. The magistrate judge herself, it's been reported, owns stock in pharmaceutical companies. But again, I can own stock in General Motors. I don't think that General Motors, I really don't control what General Motors does because I own a couple of shares of stock. So again, just owning stock in itself doesn't necessarily preclude you. Now, if she owns stock in United, maybe that would be an issue, but she does not apparently. Again, this is all reported. I haven't seen her stock portfolio. But if she had a United shares, that might be different. But just because you own stock in some healthcare industry, most everybody who has a stock portfolio has some stock in some healthcare industry related item. So those are the conflicts I think that are raised, but I don't think they raised a level, at least at this point, for her to recuse herself.
There's a couple questions just kind of surrounding the cameras in the courtroom and how it's very unusual in New York. They're not going to be in federal court. I mean, I shouldn't say that, I guess, because somebody told me they never are in even New York State court, but they are happening in this case. I would be really shocked and fall out of my chair here if they put cameras in the federal case
Yeah.
in this case. But do you think that's more evidence of them treating this case differently? How do you think that will, if at all, affect how this case goes?
It's funny. All the stuff we've seen, we really, at least I haven't seen a whole lot of discussion on why the judge made the decision to allow the cameras. Uh, it happened. It's my guess is, and I'm told that it's on a judge by judge basis whether they allow it or don't allow it in New York. But I haven't seen the reasoning. But again, you're right. This case is not the usual case. It's not being handled like every other case in New York.
Um,
And you're right about the federal case. I would drop out of my chair too if there was a TV camera in a federal trial.
Yeah, yeah. Honestly, it is surprising to me. I'm a fan of it. I think it's good for transparency. I think it's good for what's going on in the case, and I think potentially prosecutors may But both sides, I mean, I would assume if one side really had a problem, they could file a motion and get it blocked if that is the norm in New York. So I do kind of feel like, and you can tell me if you disagree, I kind of feel like both sides think potentially the public interest in this case could be good for them, or they want to show the public maybe the prosecutor wants to show the public the evidence they have against it and how bad and heinous this really was. And the defense wants to show how it's, a problem, the big bad government, they're going up against the mayor, they're going up against the feds, they're going up against the New York state, Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania. Everybody is against him. Everybody wants to hammer him. And, poor little him. It seems like both sides are potentially going to be using the public interest in the case to benefit them.
Well, sure. I guarantee you, his lawyer is a experienced. I mean, come on. I mean, but I think it was 18 years in the district
Something
attorney's.
like that.
I mean, she's no rookie. So if she didn't like those cameras in there, I guarantee you she would have done something about it. There was no, I think both sides sat back and said, okay, let it roll.
Yeah, from my perspective, it seems like there are good lawyers on the case. It seems like he's going to get a great defense, which is great. That's what every single defendant should get, and I wish every defendant could get. One thing we didn't talk about at the beginning, and kind of to go along with him being able to hire really good, experienced defense lawyers, is he is not enrolled in United Healthcare, from all reports. None of his family members were denied care, and he actually comes from a affluent family, a wealthy and well-known family. He was well-to-do growing up. He was valedictorian of his high school. He went to an Ivy League school. He's got postgraduate degrees. I mean, this is not just your, everyday person walking the streets that, got a bad hand dealt to him and couldn't afford medical care. So it's going to be interesting how they paint him as this, vigilante or a man of the people, when in reality, potentially, maybe he came from some of the people he hated, and maybe that's part of his story, right? Maybe he was close to it and he saw how it works, and he thought it was dirty or whatever, but we didn't even really talk about his background. How do you think that's going to affect the case?
Well, it's going to have a lot of effect on the case in a way. We have reports of back injuries. We have reports of back surgeries. We have report of injured during surfing in Hawaii. A lot of that is going to come in, I think, when they talk about his motive, why he's going to do it. However, if his defense has anything to do with mental illness, then they're really going to go into his background. They're really going to go into his family situation. They're really going to go into his family relationships, how he's changed. Did a light switch go off suddenly? Because if you read the interviews, a lot of his allegedly close friends have given interviews saying how wonderful he is, and then how suddenly he became isolated. That's
Mhm.
something that they're talking about. So all that is going to come in. Again, insanity makes it a much broader coming in, but he's going to have some background information come in before that jury. There's no doubt about it. And if he testifies, absolutely. And keep in mind, let's say the gun was made, it's a 3D printer, made computerized type gun. If again, I don't, get into that, but they're going to have to go into his background. How does he know how to do this? He's got a master's in computer science. So they're going to go into those types of things too to prove that he had the ability to construct this gun and put it together so that it's a working model.
And what's in the notebook, right? What's in the
Right.
notebook? What did he say? What did he write? What evidence is it going to corroborate? What is it going to point to? Because to me, I think that's going to be the key potentially to unlock everything. Then you have questions as to why was it so easy? Why would he be there with it? Was he planning something else, or was it planted on him? He made some remarks potentially about the money being planted on him. So I still think there is so much more that we're going to find out about this case. I think there is still so much more ahead of us and very little behind us. So we're going to have to keep an eye on the court process to see what comes out, see what legitimate evidence there is. Any other comments you want to make before we kind of close it out on the case? What you think is going to happen? What you're interested in finding out? What questions you still have?
Well, I think one thing that you talked about earlier about a dead time, I think that at some point there is going to be a lull where discovery is exchanged and everybody's looking at the evidence before we see all the motions and a lot of activity starts. So I think people can expect that there might be this lull at some point. I think another interesting point that I'm watching is where and how is he incarcerated? Is he going to be in the federal, the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, or is he going to be at Rikers? From what I understand, right now he's in Brooklyn, and so there's an issue there, and people are talking about, is he going to share a cell with P. Diddy? Is he going to, so we're, because they're in the same facility and they share lawyers, so who knows? But I think we're going to hear little bits and pieces like that. But people can expect there could be some kind of a lull.
Then we're officially in the twilight zone. We're living in a
Right,
simulation. If he shares a cell with
right,
P. Diddy, that would be just too
right.
wild. All right. Well, we're going to keep following it. You guys make sure you put your questions in the comments. We'll continue to look through the comments, look through the questions, answer as many of them as we can. I know this is a heated case. I know there are kind of angry people on both sides. I know not everything we're going to say is going to please people, and people are going to have their opinions about us. And it just is what it is. And that's kind of part of the internet. This case is amplifying it. This case is highlighting it, and it's going to continue. We're going to still do our best to keep talking about the legal aspects of the case, keep trying to make it easier for you guys to understand, and keep trying to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. So Dad, thanks for joining me. That's all we got for this one. Until next time, we are out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube, and don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And don't forget to check out the Lawyer You Know podcast with new seasons dropping every quarter. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, the Lawyer You Know.